Volkov had been watching the canopy below him for 3 days, and he was beginning to feel something close to satisfaction. From his hide on the eastern ridge, he had a clean sightline to the river crossing, where he'd placed his team 60 hours earlier. 9 fighters, 3 positions, concealed under vegetation, and cam netting thorough enough that the coalition's drone passes would register nothing but old-growth jungle. He had been operating in this region for 11 months. He had buried 14 of their operators in this same stretch of rainforest, and each time he had done so because the people coming through the trees believed that equipment and doctrine were a substitute for genuine knowledge of the ground. They came in with their technology and their confidence, and the jungle swallowed them anyway, because the jungle is indifferent to confidence. He lit a cigarette and checked his watch. The rescue team would insert to the northeast and push south toward the captive asset within the hour. They would walk directly into the corridor he had spent 3 days preparing. He'd built it with particular care because the asset was important enough that the Americans would send their best. And their best deserved a proper reception. He did not know, sitting on that ridge, that the team coming through the trees included someone who had spent her entire life learning to hear exactly what the jungle was already saying. Warrant Officer Ralston had run 41 operations in this region, and he was not a man given to uncertainty. But standing on the tarmac at Forward Operating Base Wainwright, watching the transport bird touch down, he felt the particular discomfort of a decision he hadn't made arriving. As a consequence, he would now have to manage. The figure who stepped off the helicopter wasn't what anyone had been expecting. Staff Sergeant Stanton moved with a deliberateness that wasn't performance. No acknowledgement of the men watching from the hangar. She carried a rifle case and a kit bag, and she crossed the tarmac with her head down, not because she was avoiding anyone's eyes, but because she was watching the ground, the way a person watches ground when the habit of reading it is older than any other habit they've formed. She looked, Ralston thought, like someone who had been paying attention to something other people couldn't see for so long, that she'd stopped noticing she was doing it. Sergeant First Class Gall noticed her differently. Galt had 15 years of operational service and opinions about nearly everything, and he did not keep them internal when the operational situation didn't require it. "That's the tracking specialist," he said. "The one they pulled from the mountain warfare cadre." "That's correct," Ralston said. "She's 28 years old. 28 and 4 months. I've been running jungle operations since before she finished basic training." Galt's voice had the flat quality of a man making a factual statement he expected to be disputed. "What exactly is she going to read for us out there that Parrish can't handle with a map and a set of eyes?" Ralston didn't answer. He was watching Stanton walk into the operations building, and he was thinking about her file, which he had read 4 times, and which still left him with more questions than it answered. The briefing room felt crowded with 6 people in it, 5 men who had spent 3 years learning each other's tolerances, and Stanton, who sat at the far end of the table with her hands flat on her knees and her eyes on the map projection as though she was already somewhere inside it. Ralston pulled up the overlay. "We have a Canadian intelligence contractor named Boulanger, separated from his team 48 hours ago and held in a compound 14 kilometers into the primary jungle. 6-hour extraction window before the insurgents move him. The approach is here. Natural choke point at the creek crossing," Parrish said. "Volkov's been working this area for the better part of a year. He knows every viable approach corridor. Which is why we're taking the northern route through the canopy corridor. Longer, harder, less predictable. Stanton runs point." Galt looked up from the map. "She runs point." "That's what I said." On a night jungle insertion 14 kilometers through contested terrain in Volkov's backyard, Galt wasn't raising his voice. He never did. Based on what? Her feelings about the trees? Stanton spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet in the way that voices become quiet when they have stopped competing for space in rooms. "Sound mapping," she said. Galt stared at her. "Come again." "A mature jungle produces a consistent acoustic baseline. Insect layers, nocturnal birds, water noise, canopy movement. When that baseline is interrupted, displaced birds, collapsed insect activity, changes in water sound downstream of a position, it indicates a disruption. The kind of disruption a team in a static ambush position creates after 18 hours of occupancy. The bush keeps a record of everything that passes through it. Most people aren't taught to read that record. I am. The silence after this was the kind that arrives when something has been said that is either completely correct or dangerously wrong, and no one is certain yet which it is. Galt turned to Ralston. The look on his face said a number of things without requiring words. Gear check at 1900, Ralston said. Range at 1830. I want to see what she's carrying before we move. He paused. All of you. She arrived at the range with a rifle that Ralston recognized had been extensively modified, and the team arrived behind her with the silent collective purpose of people assembling to disprove something. The target was 800 meters, partially screened by secondary growth. Wind variable, light failing. Galt stood with his arms crossed and said nothing, which was its own statement. Stanton settled into position without preamble. She watched the canopy above the target line for 30 seconds, tracking the movement of upper leaves, calibrating the air between the trees. Then she fired. 2 rounds to center mass. A third 2 centimeters left, adjusted for a gust she had predicted by watching the canopy shift 4 seconds before it arrived at the firing point. 1100, Ralston said. The range officer looked uncertain. Ralston waited. At 1100 meters, through standing vegetation, Stanton put 2 rounds through a silhouette that Parrish could barely resolve with binoculars. The first hit was 4 centimeters high. She called the correction herself, made it, and the second round went through the center of the head. Galt was quiet for a long moment. She can shoot, he said to Parrish, low enough that it was almost private. I know, Parrish said. Shooting a range isn't the same as combat conditions. No, it isn't. Ralston walked to where Stanton was already breaking down the rifle with the same economy she brought everything. They don't trust you, he said. I know that, sir. Tell me why they're wrong. She looked at him with the settled quality of someone who had arrived at a number and stopped second-guessing the arithmetic. Because my father spent 30 years in the northern backcountry of British Columbia reading systems that tell the truth whether or not anyone's listening. He taught me that the land keeps records. Everything that moves through it leaves a signature: sound, displacement, absence. He said the only difference between people who read it and people who don't is whether someone took the time to teach them. She paused. He died 2 years ago. But I've been reading those records since I was 8. Ralston was quiet for a moment. When we're out there, if you see something or hear something, I don't care what Galt thinks. You call it. Yes, sir. And Stanton, don't fold when they push back. Doubt is weight we can't afford to carry into that jungle. She picked up her kit. My father used to say the bush doesn't care whether you believe it. It just keeps telling the truth. They moved at 2100 hours, and the jungle received them without ceremony. Stanton ran point with the focused calm of someone solving a problem visible only to herself. Ralston followed and watched, and gradually understood that she was navigating differently than any operator he had worked with, not by landmarks and satellite imagery and compass bearings, but by the logic of the living system itself, tracking the forest's continuous self-reporting with something that looked almost like conversation. She adjusted their bearing twice in the first hour without explanation. Ralston followed each adjustment without question. Galt followed with the expression of a man holding his objections by main force. An hour and 20 minutes in, Stanton stopped, closed fist. The team froze. Stanton. Galt's voice was below a whisper, but it carried 15 years of impatience. The nightjars stopped, she said. We're in a jungle at midnight. There are no 3 species active in this section for the past 50 minutes. All of them stopped 12 seconds ago. Simultaneously, she wasn't looking at him. She was scanning the canopy to the northeast. Something changed the air in that direction, something large enough to push the entire acoustic layer into silence. Galt looked at Ralston. The expression was clear. This was what he'd been warning about. Ralston looked at Stanton. She was already inside whatever she was calculating. He could see it on her face. Not anxiety, not performance, but the absolute focus of someone reading a text in a language no one else at the table speaks. 90 seconds, she said. Galt exhaled. Ralston held up a hand. She closed her eyes. She stood in the dark jungle, and she listened the way her father had stood on the Robson Valley ridgeline at 4 in the morning and listened. Not for specific sounds, but for the architecture of silence, the way absence arranged itself around something that is trying not to exist. Position approximately 250 meters northeast, she said. Multiple bodies, stationary long enough that the insect layer has redistributed around them, not a patrol. Patrols don't displace that volume of ambient movement. That's not an actionable. It's a direction, she said. Wide left, south of the creek. We don't pass through that sector. Galt looked at Ralston. The math was plain. 40 minutes added to the approach, or a theory built on bird silence and the acoustic preferences of insects. South of the creek, Ralston said, move. Galt moved. They were 30 meters into the detour when Stanton raised her hand flat. Not a stop, a redirect, and pointed northwest without turning her head. Through the canopy, 240 meters out, a laser marker swept briefly across the trunk, then 2 more. A position adjusting because the team wasn't coming from the expected direction. 6 men. 2 RPG teams, a command-detonated device buried in the primary approach at the exact point where the canopy closed in, and there was no cover and no usable ground. If they had held the original bearing, they would have walked into it at under 50 meters. Ralston called it in, and the air support came, and the position ceased to exist, and they pushed south toward the compound where Boulanger had been hiding behind a collapsed wall for 46 hours. He cried quietly when Parrish found him, in the way that people cry when they have given up on rescue and then are rescued anyway. On the walk back to the extraction point, Galt fell into step alongside Stanton. You heard that from the birds, he said, and the insects and the downstream water noise. He was quiet for several steps. I've been in jungle operations for 12 years. I never learned to do that. My father spent 30 years learning it. He compressed about 9 years of teaching it to me before he died. Another pause. The jungle made its sounds around them. I was wrong, Galt said. Before the mission, what I said at the base, I was wrong. Stanton glanced at him sideways, a brief, level look that registered the words as real and moved on. I know. What matters is you moved when Ralston called it. The intelligence pulled from the ambush site rewrote the threat picture. The 6 men Stanton had heard before anyone could see them were not cartel fighters. Their equipment matched the Spetsnaz train network that had been responsible for 11 previous coalition deaths in this region. Volkov's network. The position had been purpose-built on the expected approach corridor. Someone had anticipated the insertion down to the route selection. Colonel Treadwell ran the debrief with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste words when the results spoke clearly. Stanton's detour call prevented what our analysts are now calling a near-catastrophic outcome. Formally, that goes on the record. She paused. Less formally, Stanton, the organizations above this command are going to develop an interest in what you can do. I want you to be clear-eyed about that. I'm clear-eyed about it, ma'am. Good, because my question is, what do you want? Stanton answered without hesitation. To stay with this team. They moved when I called it. That's what I need. Treadwell looked at Ralston. She stays, he said. 3 weeks later, Ralston's team ran an interdiction on Volkov's primary resupply corridor. Stanton ran point again, recalibrated to the new elevation's different acoustic register over the first hour, and at the 3rd hour redirected the team with a bearing change smooth enough that only Galt, directly behind her, registered it. Something, he said. 2 things, she said the same way. Position at R11, and someone watching the position. Galt processed this, counter-sniper. Watching to see if we walk into the first one. 3 steps of silence. Then Galt said, tell me what you need. The shot she made, 430 meters, through uneven canopy, to a man who had been still long enough to become part of the tree he was braced against, was not her most technically demanding. But it was the shot Galt described afterward as the single, most precise act he had witnessed in 15 years of service. Not because of the distance, because she had known he was there before any instrument they carried could have confirmed it. Volkov's counter-sniper died without triggering the position behind him. In the disorganization that followed, Ralston's team dismantled the resupply chain and was gone before the response force could orient. The network that had been sustaining Volkov's operations went dark that night. Volkov himself was picked up at a border crossing 6 days later by a partner service. The analysis of his equipment bag, when it came back, showed that he had set up the counter-snipper position specifically to observe and record Stanton's methodology. He had been trying to understand how the interdiction of his first ambush had happened, trying to model a system he could then predict and neutralize. He hadn't been able to do it because what Stanton was doing didn't map to any doctrine he had trained against. She wasn't running a protocol. She was having a conversation with an environment that had been speaking to her since before she was old enough to carry a rifle. Ralston found her on the perimeter berm that evening, sitting with her rifle across her knees, watching the tree line in the way that he now understood was not simply watchfulness. "Your father," he said, "what do you think he'd make of all this?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, the quiet of someone who already has one and is deciding how to hold it. "He'd say I was lucky to find people who trust the silence when I call it," she said. "He'd also say I should eat something and get some sleep before I started thinking I was indispensable." Ralston found himself laughing, which was not something that happened easily. Practical man. Very. He said sentiment is fine, but a cold read is worth more than a warm feeling when you're 14 kilometers from the nearest friendly position. She looked at the tree line once more. He wasn't wrong about much. The jungle settled into its pre-dawn register, that specific compression of sound before the light begins to change things. And Stanton sat in it, with the patience of someone who has always known that the most important information arrives quietly, and that the only skill that matters is being still enough and paying enough attention to hear it when it does. She had made a promise to her father in a hospital room in northern British Columbia, the week before he died, that the knowledge he had spent a lifetime building and 30 years teaching her would not be set aside because someone in a briefing room decided it didn't fit the standard model. She had kept that promise the only way that promise ever gets kept. Not by arguing, but by listening when everyone else stopped, and calling what she heard without apology, and trusting that the land would keep its record whether or not anyone believed it could. The tree line breathed in the way it does just before dawn, and Stanton kept watching, and the silence told her nothing except that the sector was clear, which was, in its own way, everything she needed to know.